January 15th, 1919. Boston. Midday. Unseasonably warm for winter. The North End neighborhood, crowded with tenements, factories, and warehouses, bustled with workers and families going about their routines. Then, without warning, a sound like machine gun fire tore through the air. A massive storage tank, 5 stories tall and containing over 2 million gallons of molasses, split open. A wave of thick, dark syrup, 15 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, exploded into the streets. It crushed buildings. It overturned vehicles. It swept people off their feet and drowned them in sticky, suffocating darkness. The wave was so powerful it ripped a firehouse off its foundation, killed horses instantly, and bent steel girders like they were made of clay. 21 people died. Another 150 were injured. The molasses covered everything, seeping into basements, coating streets, and trapping victims in a viscous tomb. Rescue efforts were nearly impossible. The thick syrup made movement agonizing. Bodies were not recovered for days. The smell of molasses lingered in the North End for decades. The Great Molasses Flood was not just a bizarre accident. It was a disaster caused by corporate negligence, structural failure, and a complete disregard for public safety. In this video, we shall shine the light on one of the strangest industrial disasters in American history and explore how a wave of molasses became a deadly catastrophe. This is the story of greed, incompetence, and the day Boston drowned in syrup. The tank that ruptured on January 15, 1919, was built in 1915 by the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol. The company used molasses as a raw material for producing industrial alcohol, which was then converted into munitions during World War I. With the war creating massive demand for alcohol-based explosives, the company rushed to expand production capacity. Speed, not safety, was the priority. The tank was constructed hastily. It stood 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, designed to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. The structure was a riveted steel cylinder, painted brown to hide rust and leaks. From the moment it was completed, the tank showed signs of trouble. Residents in the area reported hearing groaning and creaking sounds emanating from the structure. Molasses leaked from the seams, dripping onto the streets below. Children would collect the syrup in buckets. Workers complained that the tank was unstable. Arthur Gell, the manager overseeing the tank's construction, was not an engineer. He had no technical training in structural design. The construction process itself was riddled with flaws. Rivet holes were poorly aligned. Steel plates were unevenly welded. Safety inspections were either ignored or superficial. When leaks became visible, the company's response was not to repair the tank, but to repaint it brown so the leaking molasses would be less noticeable. Concerns were raised by employees and local residents. They were dismissed. The company insisted the tank was safe. Any suggestion otherwise was treated as alarmist or economically inconvenient. The profits from wartime alcohol production were too significant to interrupt for structural repairs. By early 1919, the war had ended, but the tank remained in use. On January 12th, a shipment of molasses arrived from the Caribbean. The thick syrup was pumped into the already stressed tank, bringing it to near capacity. The molasses was warmer than usual, having come from a tropical climate. Over the next 2 days, Boston experienced an unusual warm spell. Temperatures rose above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, unseasonably mild for mid-January. The warmth caused the molasses inside the tank to ferment slightly, producing carbon dioxide gas. Pressure built inside the structure. The tank, already weakened by poor construction, could not withstand the strain. The steel plates began to buckle. The rivets, improperly installed years earlier, began to fail. On the morning of January 15th, workers near the tank reported hearing metallic groaning. No one evacuated. No alarm was raised. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the tank exploded. Witnesses described the sound as deafening. Some thought it was a bomb. Others believed a train had derailed. The reality was worse. The steel tank ruptured catastrophically, releasing 2.3 million gallons of molasses in seconds. The wave surged outward with terrifying speed. A wall of dark syrup 15 feet high, moving at 35 miles per hour. The molasses struck the elevated railway tracks first, bending steel supports and nearly derailing a passing train. It smashed into buildings, collapsing wooden structures and flooding basements. A firehouse was ripped from its foundation and crushed. Fire Captain Michael Geoghegan, along with several firefighters, was trapped inside. Geoghegan's body was not recovered for hours, buried beneath debris and syrup. The waves swept through the streets, engulfing everything in its path. Horses pulling wagons were knocked over and drowned. Vehicles were overturned. People walking along the street were caught in the surge. Some were killed instantly, crushed by the force of the initial wave. Others were trapped in the molasses, unable to move as the thick syrup pulled them under. The viscosity of molasses made escape nearly impossible. Unlike water, which flows and disperses, molasses clings. It is dense, sticky, and suffocating. Victims who were submerged could not swim to the surface. Those who tried to run found their legs immobilized. The syrup filled lungs, eyes, and mouths. Breathing became impossible. Drowning in molasses was slow and agonizing. Rescue efforts began immediately, but the conditions were nightmarish. First responders waded into waist-deep molasses, struggling to reach victims. The syrup clung to their clothes, their boots, their hands. Every step was exhausting. Tools became useless, coated in sticky residue. Victims trapped under debris could not be pulled free. The molasses acted like glue, holding wreckage in place. Sailors from a nearby Navy ship, the USS Nantucket, were among the first to arrive. They brought hoses and pumps, attempting to wash away the molasses with seawater. It did not work. Molasses and water do not mix easily. The syrup simply spread, coating a wider area. The sailors switched to sawdust, spreading it over the molasses to absorb some of the liquid. It helped marginally, but the streets remained impassable. Bodies were recovered slowly. Some victims were found hours later, others days. One child, a 10-year-old boy named Pasquale Antosca, was not found for nearly a week. His body was buried under debris and molasses in a cellar. The smell of death, mixed with the sickly sweet odor of syrup, became unbearable. The final death toll was 21. Another 150 were injured, some with broken bones, others with severe lacerations from flying debris. The economic damage was estimated at over $100 million in modern currency. Dozens of buildings were destroyed. The cleanup took weeks. The North End neighborhood was coated in a sticky brown residue that took months to fully remove. For decades afterward, residents claimed they could still smell molasses on hot summer days. The disaster sparked immediate outrage, but the controversy that followed revealed something darker: a corporate strategy of deflection, denial, and deception. The Purity Distilling Company, faced with lawsuits and public fury, refused to accept responsibility. Instead, the company advanced a conspiracy theory. They claimed the tank had been sabotaged by anarchists. This was not an accident, they argued, but an act of terrorism. The theory was absurd. There was no evidence of explosives, no credible suspects, and no plausible motive. But the company repeated the claim, hoping to shift blame away from their own negligence. The anarchist theory was convenient. The year 1919 was marked by social unrest. Labor strikes, political violence, and anti-immigrant sentiment were widespread. Blaming anarchists played into public fears and diverted attention from the structural failures that had caused the disaster. The company's lawyers pushed the narrative aggressively, using it to delay legal proceedings and avoid immediate liability. But the evidence was overwhelming. Investigators found no signs of sabotage. What they did find was a long history of negligence. The tank had been poorly designed, shoddily constructed, and inadequately maintained. The steel was too thin for a structure of that size. The rivets were improperly installed. The company had ignored repeated warnings about leaks and structural instability. Internal documents revealed that engineers had raised concerns about the tank's safety, but those concerns were dismissed by management. The legal battle that followed was one of the first major cases in American history to rely heavily on expert testimony and scientific analysis. Over 3,000 witnesses testified. Engineers analyzed the tank's design and construction. Metallurgists examined the failed steel. The trial lasted 3 years. In 1925, the court ruled in favor of the victims. The company was found liable for the disaster. They were ordered to pay damages totaling nearly $1 million, a significant sum at the time. The ruling was a watershed moment. It established that companies could be held accountable for industrial disasters caused by negligence. It set a precedent for stricter building codes and safety regulations. But the victory was hollow for many of the victims' families. No amount of money could bring back the dead. No legal judgment could erase the trauma. Socially, the disaster highlighted the dangers faced by working-class immigrant communities. The North End was home to Italian immigrants, laborers, and their families. They lived in overcrowded tenements near industrial sites because they had no other options. When the tank ruptured, it was their homes that were destroyed, their family members who died. The disaster was not random. It was the result of corporate decisions that prioritized profit over the safety of vulnerable populations. The controversy also extended to the government's role. Boston's building inspectors had approved the tank's construction despite its obvious flaws. City officials had failed to enforce safety standards. The disaster revealed systemic failures in regulatory oversight, failures that would be repeated in industrial accidents across the country for decades to come. The immediate aftermath of the flood left the North End in ruins, but the long-term consequences reshaped industrial safety standards, legal accountability, and public awareness of corporate negligence. For the survivors and families of the victims, the consequences were devastating. Many lost their homes, their livelihoods, and their loved ones. The psychological trauma was profound. Survivors described nightmares, an inability to eat anything sweet, and a persistent fear of industrial structures. Children who witnessed the disaster carried the memories for the rest of their lives. The community, already struggling with poverty and discrimination, was further destabilized. Economically, the flood caused widespread disruption. Businesses in the North End were forced to close. Cleanup costs were enormous. The molasses seeped into the ground, contaminating soil and groundwater. Buildings had to be demolished and rebuilt. The financial burden fell disproportionately on the immigrant families who lived and worked in the area. Legally, the disaster led to significant changes. The court's ruling against the Purity Distilling Company established that corporations could not escape liability by blaming external forces or fabricating conspiracy theories. The case set a precedent for holding companies accountable for industrial accidents caused by negligence. It also spurred the development of stricter building codes and engineering standards. Structures were required to be reviewed by licensed engineers. Safety inspections became more rigorous. The disaster became a case study in engineering failure, taught in universities as an example of what happens when corners are cut. Politically, the flood contributed to growing labor and safety movements. Workers demanded safer conditions. Unions used the disaster as evidence of corporate indifference to employee and public safety. The tragedy became a rallying point for those advocating for stronger regulations and government oversight of industrial activities. Culturally, the Molasses Flood became part of Boston's historical identity. It was remembered in local folklore, commemorated in plaques and memorials, and retold in books and documentaries. The North End residents for generations claimed they could still smell molasses on hot days, a claim that was dismissed as myth until researchers discovered that molasses had indeed seeped so deeply into the ground that trace amounts remained in the soil. Scientifically, the disaster prompted research into the behavior of non-Newtonian fluids. Molasses, when subjected to sudden force, behaves differently than water. It can flow like a liquid under certain conditions but resist movement under others. Understanding these properties became important for industrial applications and disaster preparedness. The broader consequence was a shift in how industrial disasters were perceived. The Molasses Flood demonstrated that even seemingly benign substances, like syrup, could become deadly under the right circumstances. It highlighted the importance of proper engineering, rigorous safety standards, and corporate accountability. The disaster was not an act of God. It was a preventable tragedy caused by human decisions. The legacy of the Great Molasses Flood is one of tragedy, accountability, and a cautionary reminder of the consequences of corporate negligence and inadequate regulation. Historically, the flood remains one of the most unusual industrial disasters ever recorded. The image of a city street flooded with molasses, people drowning in syrup, and buildings crushed by a wave of sticky liquid is so surreal that it has become part of American folklore. But beneath the strangeness lies a serious lesson about industrial safety and the human cost of cutting corners. Legally, the disaster's legacy is profound. The court case that followed set important precedents for corporate liability and engineering standards. It established that companies could not evade responsibility by fabricating conspiracy theories or blaming unforeseeable events. The ruling reinforced the principle that those who profit from industrial activities must also bear responsibility for the risks they create. This principle has shaped product liability law, workplace safety regulations, and environmental protections for over a century. Culturally, the Molasses Flood has been remembered in literature, film, and popular media. It has been depicted in documentaries, referenced in novels, and analyzed in academic studies. The disaster has become a symbol of the dangers of rapid industrialization and the importance of putting safety before profit. It is remembered not just as a bizarre accident, but as a preventable tragedy that exposed systemic failures in corporate governance and regulatory oversight. Scientifically, the flood contributed to a deeper understanding of fluid dynamics and structural engineering. Researchers studied the behavior of molasses under different conditions, the forces exerted by large volumes of liquid, and the failure modes of riveted steel structures. The disaster became a case study in engineering schools, used to teach future engineers about the importance of proper design, material selection, and safety margins. Psychologically, the legacy of the flood is carried by the descendants of those who survived. The trauma of the event was passed down through families. Stories of the disaster were told and retold, preserving the memory of those who died and ensuring that the lessons learned were not forgotten. The North End community, resilient in the face of tragedy, rebuilt and endured. But the shadow of the Molasses Flood remained. Ethically, the disaster raises questions about responsibility and justice. The company that built the tank prioritized profit over safety. The managers who ignored warnings chose convenience over accountability. The government officials who approved the flawed structure failed in their duty to protect the public. The Molasses Flood was not an accident. It was a foreseeable consequence of negligence, greed, and indifference. The most enduring legacy of the Great Molasses Flood is the reminder that industrial progress must be tempered by responsibility. Technologies, structures, and systems that benefit society also carry risks. Those risks must be managed carefully, transparently, and with accountability. When they are not, the consequences can be catastrophic. In the end, the Great Molasses Flood was a tragedy that should never have happened. 21 people died because a company chose profit over safety, because inspectors failed to do their jobs, and because warnings were ignored. The wave of molasses that swept through Boston's North End on that January day was not an act of nature. It was the result of human choices, and those choices and their consequences should not be forgotten.